Screenwriting for Hollywood, Part 4. The next issue, as far as constructing your plot, and that is, put a character in jeopardy. When any characters are in jeopardy, it does not have to just be the hero. The reader will keep turning the pages to see if they get out okay. And again, it doesn't have to be life-threatening. It could be danger of humiliation, loss of face. Embarrassment is a very effective kind of jeopardy. Because we've all suffered that, and it is something we all loathe, and will avoid it at all cost. And another plot, the structural device for plotting, is echoing. Echoing means repeating the situation, or a line of dialogue, or an object, a literal object that we see on the screen. Because that repetition gives the audience kind of an anchor to hang on to. They're reminded of previous scenes, and it can either be funny that something's repeated, or it can even indicate a change in the character. The next structural issue, the next set of devices, has to do with credibility. These are structural principles that will enable the audience to believe this David and Goliath story you created. And the first principle is, you only have one fantasy per film. And what I mean by that is this. Every movie is a fantasy. Every movie is a make-believe story. It could not happen in real life. Even the true stories are fantasies, because the only reason a true story ends up on the screen is because something happened that seemed bigger than life. So, if you want to write any movie, think about what is the what-if fantasy here. What is this thing that makes the story bigger than life? And then everything else has to be grounded in reality. Everybody has to react to that situation in a normal, realistic way. Okay? Next of all, the character's behavior must be consistent with their background. In other words, you can't have a character do something that would be completely unrealistic for a person like that to do. Most people who are in danger, for example, try to escape or try to get help. And how many movies have you seen that just made no sense because the characters just stick around in the situation of danger just because the screenwriter wanted them to? And if you're in trouble because you want your character to accomplish some goal that an everyday person might not be able to, one way you can get around that is using the structural device called foreshadowing. At least, this is what I refer to as foreshadowing. Again, this isn't the same definition you'll hear from other writing teachers necessarily. Foreshadowing means giving credibility to characters' actions or abilities by justifying them or introducing them earlier in the story. And it is the best tool you can use for making your story more believable. Okay, the next category of structural concerns is about time and making the most effective use of time in your script. And there are a couple ways to do that. The first is to realize that if you're writing a thriller, you're writing a suspense thriller or an action movie, a race against time is tremendously emotionally involving. It is the principle of the ticking clock because the race against time ups the stakes and gives it a much faster pace. But there is another way to make the most effective use of time that would apply not only to thrillers but any kind of movie, and that is condense the time spent on the film as much as you can. Most Hollywood movies take place in a period of hours, days, or weeks. Rarely, years, or decades. That's why most movies are not about series of events. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that personal stories are also something that's very tough to do. Because they're so great a temptation to say, a movie is about a lot of interesting things that happen to somebody. The movie is about one bigger-than-life thing that happens to somebody and how they resolve it. So, audiences want a condensed time span. And, to add to this, use of time is an even more powerful device, and that is, when you announce to the audience the amount of time remaining. So, it's not sufficient just to have the story take place in a condensed period of time, you want to tell the audience how long will be. That's why in Ransom the bad guys say, "You've got 48 hours. Or, that's why in the beginning of Twister, the person in the Stormwatch Center says, "Look, there's these two weather patterns coming together here." And somebody else says, "What does that mean?" She says, "It means it's going to be a busy day." And the audience subconsciously hears that and thinks, "Oh, great, this is going to be a movie that's all resolved in 24 hours. So, you tell the audience how long the story's going to last, and they may not consciously get it, but subconsciously they do. Obviously, you can't write a movie like Gandhi and have it take place in one afternoon. But that's the reason that most biographies tank at the box office. Now, you said, well, what about Braveheart? $100 million at the box office. And I would say, yes, but what was the difference? The difference was, Braveheart was the story of a guy who wanted to win freedom for Scotland. It wasn't everything that happened to William Wallace throughout his life, and his life did not consist of a series of events, the way Chaplin's did. William Wallace's life was built around one burning desire, and it was all about, will he get freedom for Scotland, or won't he? Okay. The next structural issue is, you've got to grab the reader within the first 10 pages. Undoubtedly, forget if you've read any book on screenwriting or taking any class or lecture about screenwriting. You've got to grab the reader in the first 10 pages. Now, how do you do that? You do it in the way you create emotion in the rest of the screenplay. First, if it's an action movie, get some action into the film as soon as you possibly can. Or, if it's a comedy, something funny better happen fairly quickly. And the next thing you want to do, and this will also help contribute to the emotion, is you must establish that necessary identification right away. Or getting emotionally involved with the character, because the identification devices also get us emotionally involved with the movie. So, the two work hand in hand. And another thing you want to do in the opening of the film is, you've got to set the tone of the movie. Again, if it's a comedy, something funny has got to happen. If it's gonna be a thriller, it's gotta have a sense of anticipated jeopardy, at least, if not, immediate action to establish a fairly fast pace. The next issue you need to deal with is how much information do you give the reader. In other words, these are structural devices that affect what you tell the reader when. What do they know and when did they know it? In other words, one of the issues is, you must create anticipation. One of the most powerful structural devices there is anticipation. People like to guess what's going to happen next when they hear a story or when they see a movie. They don't always want to be right, but they want to guess. It is the anticipation of conflict that keeps the audience on the edge of its seat. That's why, in Jaws, it is not the shark that is scary, it's the dorsal fin. Because the most frightening scenes are the ones when the fin is coming through the water, or the barrels are coming through the water, and we hear, "Dara, Dara." Because it creates anticipation of the violence to come. And one of the best ways you could create that anticipation is using the next device, and that is superior position. Superior position means the audience knows something that some of the characters in the movie don't know. You tell the reader something that is still a secret from some of the characters in your script. Another issue is, you want to create curiosity in the audience. Don't give away everything right away. People love a puzzle, and then, even though you want to create anticipation, you have to surprise the audience occasionally. Now, I would say, create lots of anticipation and a limited amount of surprise. That's the most effective sort of balance. Every once in a while use the surprise element to stir emotions, but you can't lull the audience into thinking that everything is predictable. The last structural arena you need to deal with is, will the audience leave the theater satisfied? The first issue here is, the ending must be consistent with the story you've told. An audience can't feel like an ending that is contrived in either direction. The trumped-up happy ending when it doesn't make sense, or more likely, in a lot of films, a down ending that seems arbitrary. In other words, when you've established the tone, and the characters, and the credibility of your story, when the movie is over, it should have ultimately seemed like, this is the best possible way that this movie could end. Now, that does not mean you have to give your movie a happy ending. Even if it's a sad or tragic ending, I think you have to give it an ending where the audience feels some sense of uplift. The torch has been passed, humanity has been preserved, life is worth living. In other words, a sad or tragic ending may be appropriate, I don't think it a defeated ending is. Nor can you give it an ending with it that is ambiguous. As I said earlier, you must clearly resolve the hero's outer motivation. And last of all, given a choice, give it a happy ending. Because happy endings sell, and Hollywood is very nervous about sad or tragic endings. And with good reason. One of the reasons we go to see movies is to see problems solved, no matter how crummy or depressing our own lives are. When we go to a movie for 2 hours, we can be in the theater, and we become someone who faces obstacles far greater than we face, and we win. And there is a wonderfully powerful, uplifting, almost cathartic experience. And when you choose to give your movie a sad or tragic ending, you are robbing the audience of that experience. Now, we've come to one of my favorite parts of the course, and that is where we talk about character growth and theme. Now that you understand more clearly about the need for a clear visible outer motivation for the hero and the way characters break down and how the plot can be structured, now you're ready to explore the deeper levels of meaning that a screenplay can achieve. The transformation for the hero from someone who is evolved or someone who possesses some inner flaw and someone who is fully evolved or fully realizes his or her potential. To understand how character growth and theme can work, you first need to understand the concept of inner motivation and inner conflict. If the outer motivation is the answer to the question, what does the character want? Inner motivation is a better answer to the question, why does the character want this? And the answer is always some form, some path to the same objective. And that is, to achieve greater feelings of self-worth. So, another way to look at inner motivation is that it is the path the hero thinks will lead to a higher self-concept. It is the path the hero thinks will enable her to feel better about herself. But then, he has to come face to face with his inner conflict. Inner conflict is whatever prevents the character from achieving true self-worth. Now, this is tricky. You might logically think that inner conflict is whatever stands in the way of the hero achieving his inner motivation. But it's not, because remember, the hero may be pursuing the wrong path. The inner conflict is whatever stands in the way of the character achieving true self-worth. To figure out what the inner conflict for a character is, listen to the dialogue and ask yourself these two questions. Number 1. What terrifies this character emotionally? What scares this character down to his socks on an emotional level? Not fear of death, but an emotional fear, something that, on the inside, terrifies this character, that he does not want to face. Then you must ask, what will the character do to avoid experiencing that fear? And that's his inner conflict. Okay. What does all this have to do with character growth? Character growth is the process for the character of recognizing and overcoming her inner conflict. And character growth occurs as a result of the outer conflict in the movie. This is the wonderful way that the inner life for the character connects to the visible life of your character. The theme of a movie is, simply, the character growth made universal. In other words, turning the growth for the hero of the film into something that has universal application to anyone in the audience. And one way you can look at character growth is, it is the process of learning to define oneself rather than to be defined by other people. As with Thelma and Louise, who are defined fully by men in the beginning and define who they are at the end. In Body Heat, he dreams of the big score. So, his inner motivation is lust and desire, money and sex. He wants the rich woman who lives on the hill, the beautiful rich woman, to get away from her husband because he has none of that. He's like a second-rate attorney who lives in a room that he rents, and he'll never amount to anything he doesn't figure, but if you can get this woman and her money, then he'll be there. So, his path to self-worth is lust and greed. Now, notice that this is what the character thinks will lead to self-worth. It isn't necessarily the right path. In fact, very often, more often than not, I would venture to say, movies are about characters who are pursuing the wrong path to self-worth. The character thinks this will enable him to feel better about himself, and his growth is actually going to be the process of learning he was wrong and finding what the path the character thinks will enable him to feel better about himself, and therefore, it makes him want to pursue this outer motivation. Now, there is another way you can approach inner conflict by using the other characters in the movie. Remember I said earlier that it's important to keep the labels on your characters because they're going to become important later. And in some movies, it works like this. This is a little more complicated and probably a little less apparent in some films, but it's still there sufficiently frequently that I think you can look for it. And that is, the inner conflict for your hero is embodied by the nemesis, it is revealed by the reflection, and the romance is the reward for having overcome it. And by the way, the movie I recommend you rent before you watch any other movie is Working Girl. Because it is the most formulaic great script that you will read or great movie that you'll see. I don't want you to go watch Forrest Gump or Pulp Fiction or English Patient because they pushed the boundaries way too much. I want you to reinforce these concepts before you start looking at the exceptions. So, go watch Working Girl and figure out who are the character categories and what's the structure and so on. And the characters are very straightforward. The hero is Tess, Melanie Griffith's character. She wants to put together a merger. The outer conflict is she's only a secretary and her boss is trying to steal the idea from her. Her boss Sigourney Weaver, her name is Catherine, is her nemesis, the reflection is Sin, the Joan Cusack character, who's her best friend, most closely aligned with her, and also helps her because she pretends to be Tess's secretary, and Tess is pretending to be a broker. And the romance is Jack Traynor, the Harrison Ford character, who is intertwined with the hero's outer motivation, and also the object of her desire. Okay? So, it fits the categories perfectly. Now, the inner motivation for Tess, the reason she wants to put together this deal, is she wants to be a success. Her path to self-worthy is success on Wall Street. That's fine, that's a fine path to self-worth. She doesn't have to learn that she's picked the wrong path, but she still has an inner conflict. Because, ultimately, the thing that prevents her from achieving real self-worth is she is confusing image with reality. And the way I know that is because it is embodied by the nemesis, revealed by the reflection, and the romance is a reward for overcoming. Now, what good is all this? Well, I think it's important because I want you to be able to recognize this in the movies you see. So, you can see greater depth of film and see how this character arc actually work rather than just floundering around and see the characters change. Cause characters can't change overnight. You can't give your character steroids. You've got to have gradual growth as a result of the obstacles the characters come up against. But of course, an even more important thing is, I want you to understand how this works so you can do it in your own screenplay. But there is an absolutely critical rule when it comes to developing growth for your characters, when it comes to developing theme in your screenplay. And that is, you can never let the deeper levels of meaning in your script, you can never let the character growth interfere with the story. And that is a mistake many writers make. You want so desperately to say something deep and meaningful and symbolic and universal that you lose sight of your primary job. And that is, you're a storyteller. If you want to be a screenwriter, you are a storyteller, and the deeper meaning grows out of the plot. It doesn't supplant it, it doesn't substitute for it. So, get the story right. Structure your story, develop your characters, define your plot. And then, as you're running in the second draft or the third draft, then start seeing what is emerging about your characters that you can bring to the surface more effectively through these methods I just said. But don't ever start within. It'll get you nowhere. The key is, go for the fear. Fear is always the key to everything when it comes to deeper meaning. In the case you haven't noticed, by the way, all of this is true for real life as well. If you really listen, I just saved you years of therapy, I'm telling you. Because, if you want to know what's really going on with you, ask yourself what's terrifying you, and what are you doing to avoid that fear. And if you can find out and confront that, that's going to be a real path to self-worth, more than accomplishing some visible goal you may be running around trying to pursue. Not that there's anything wrong with pursuing the goals. We gotta do that. But you will achieve those goals more readily and more fulfillingly if you can get in touch with whatever you're doing to avoid your deepest fears.